All right. Welcome everyone to this webinar. My name is George Hernandez, and I'm the convener of the IEAA's Marketing and Recruitment Network, as well as the CEO and founder of Sofiri. On behalf of myself and deputy conveners, Michelle Hosman and Tanvir Shahid, we would like to welcome you all. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that this forum is being hosted and recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this forum. Just a few housekeeping items before we start. We had time scheduled for questions at the end of each panelist presentation. So ask your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ensure that they are seen. There will be recording of today's session available to all registered participants. We will make this available along with any available PowerPoint slides next week. Now, on March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization Director General, Dr. Tedros, officially characterized COVID-19 as a pandemic. This is exactly 1 year ago. And here we are now. And the IEAA's Marketing and Recruitment Network is providing you with an update of the year that it has been of Australia's fourth largest export. What happened to and within the sector throughout the past 12 months, and what is, of course, to come for the next 12. This webinar will combine data with experience to paint a holistic picture of a year in international education. You will first hear from Steve Nerlich, Director of the International Research and Analysis Unit at the Australian Government Department of Education, Skills and Employment. And he'll be talking to you on the latest data and current trends in the Australian international student recruitment landscape, the different government and non-government sources of data and information, the value of each resource, and how to best analyze this data, insights that can help your student marketing and recruitment plans and tactics for sure. Next week, the webinar will provide you also with a real-life examples of an Australian university intelligently innovating marketing and recruitment efforts. Marcus Binchman, Director of International Marketing at MacQuarie University, will share with you how a sophisticated online student recruitment marketing strategy works, the process of inside sales and conversion optimization, how international marketing benefits from personalized transactions and communications. So over to you, Steve. I think you're muted.
Sorry, thank you, George. Good morning, everyone. So I think you know who I am. I received my PhD recently, so I'm now calling myself Dr. Steve Nerlich. So my session, which will be about 20 minutes and comprises nearly 10 slides, as George outlined, I'll show you some what I think are relevant data sources to describe the current situation in Australian international education, particularly in the context of COVID-19. And I'm also going to attempt to sort of plot out at least the near future, so perhaps what's going to happen in the first half of 2021. So I might go to the first slide, or the second slide, sorry. So what we were doing during 2020 and continuing this year was something unprecedented. So we arranged a partnership with the Department of Home Affairs to use their visa data to identify the location of international students. Because the big issue, of course, with COVID-19 is suddenly international airfare pretty much shut down. A lot of students who were planning to study in Australia were unable to enter the country. Nonetheless, we did find quite a few remained enrolled. A smaller proportion have deferred, and I'll talk about them in a later slide. But yeah, I guess the quite unique situation we found in 2020 was we had lots of students on student visas who were not actually in Australia at all, but were nonetheless continuing their studies. This data is actually totally available to people, but there's sort of, I don't want to say legal, but at least, I don't know, professional respect issues for why we didn't want to publish data that really is Home Affairs data. So we sort of came up with an arrangement where we email list to peak bodies, to state and territory governments. This is essentially a mailing list. If you want to get on it, you're welcome to email me and we'll put you on. But what you get is this very summarized picture here, but you get lots of data in that email. This is just a quick snapshot of it. But for example, in December 2020, at the end of 2020, this was the picture we were seeing. So you'll find with Home Affairs data, they have a figure of all student visa holders. That's actually comprised of primary and secondary visa holders. Primary visa holders are essentially those people who are going to become students. The secondary visa holders are family members. So what you can see here is something like 20% of those visa holders, particularly the primary visa holders, were outside Australia and kind of stuck outside Australia due to the travel restrictions, although 80% remained in Australia. And we think there was also a situation where many students, or student visa holders, I should say, couldn't leave the country because international travel has been so restricted in both directions, in and out of Australia. Anyhow, as I said, we had a partnership with Home Affairs to paint a picture of what was happening to international students. So that third row is where we've matched Home Affairs data to our student data that we get through what's called the PRISM system. So there you can see not all primary student visa holders were necessarily enrolled at a particular point in time, but certainly most of them were. As I say at the bottom there, 87% of all primary student visa holders were enrolled students in December. And again, with those enrolled student numbers, although a smaller number, the proportional split of who was in and outside Australia is very similar. So we found between 21 and 26% of our enrolled students at the end of the year were still enrolled, still studying, but outside Australia. So this data is quite valuable to tell you that story and to sort of confirm the fact that even though students can't travel to Australia, a lot of them are still continuing to study. And if I can go to the next slide, what I've done here is, as I said, we were reporting this data throughout 2020. So what I've done here is just to capture a monthly update of that data as the year 2020 progressed. So from the middle of the year in July to December, what we saw in that grand total, sorry, I should stop pointing at things. What you saw in that grand total column was a decline of 6% in enrolled students in the second half of 2020. But in fact, with respect to the in and outside Australia split of those students, the main drop was in the number of enrolled students in Australia. The number of enrolled students outside Australia actually increased, and it increased quite substantially, going from 66,000 to over 100,000 by December. So I think from a marketing angle, that's quite important to understand. We still, ironically, perhaps have a growing market of students outside Australia who are showing willingness to either continue their studies. There's also a component in there of new students who never studied in Australia before, but nonetheless have signed up to commence their studies outside Australia. I imagine with the expectation that they will eventually be able to come to Australia when the planes are flying again. So that's quite interesting when you track that data over time, as you can see here. Next slide, please. So the big picture for 2020 is here. So here we've mapped out our year-to-date count of international student enrolments over the course of the year and compared that to past years. So here I'm just ignoring the fact that 20% of students were outside Australia. This is just a total count of everyone enrolled, regardless of their location. What you can see in that 2020 line is 2020 started off as a fairly routine year. Once again, we saw something approaching 10% growth, as we've been seeing in the last 5 years, as that chart shows. But as the year 2020 developed, numbers started declining in comparison to the previous year. And by halfway through the year, by July, 2020 numbers were down on what they had been in 2019. And by the end of the year, December, you can see that 2020 line has actually gone back down to about where we were at the end of 2018. So I think that's perhaps the summarized picture of what happened in 2020. We've kind of gone back in time to where we were in 2018. And I think that's important just to note, you know, a lot of the doom merchants in early 2020 were predicting our numbers were going to go to zero and that sort of thing. I mean, that was never really going to happen, I didn't think, because students are committed to at least completing the studies they've started, notwithstanding some students who may have just left school were committed to starting their studies through whatever mechanism and context was available to them. So it's never going to be the case, even in 2021 or 2022, that numbers will ever go to zero. We're just obviously not going to see as much growth as we've seen in previous years. Next slide, please. And this is essentially what was happening in 2020. We had enrolled students maintaining their numbers fairly consistently through the year. I think IEAA and Phil Honeywood used the terminology of students sticking to what they started with. So that's certainly what you can see here, but the big impacts really came in July, when normally, for example, in 2019 there, you would see an arrival of a new students who were starting their studies in second semester. That still happened a bit in 2020, but certainly not to the same extent. So the overall decline in international student enrollments we saw in 2020, which was just down 7%, was mainly about that loss of new students in July that we normally see in a normal year. Next slide, please. And this is that picture of our commencements data. So here you can see, I'm just focusing on the second half of the year. That's where we were really seeing the COVID impact. So when you look at the whole year 2020, things don't look so bad because the first quarter was essentially a normal, was normal, shall I say. It was really towards the end of March that travel restrictions began to impact on student numbers. So this is sort of the commencements picture we saw when COVID-19 had really hit hard. So there was quite a substantial drop in commencements compared to a normal year such as 2019. Most of that impact was in particularly the LCOS sector and the non-award sector, those short course sectors, which very much rely on new students arriving throughout the year rather than just having students commencing at the start of the year and continuing through the whole year. So the biggest impact was on those sectors. Schools was fairly heavily hit also. Interestingly, with vet, we found that was certainly the most resilient sector in terms of impact of COVID-19. We think a lot of that is the way that vet students tend to engage in study in Australia. A lot of them are much more likely to be working in Australia as they study. And we think that there's a general pattern of many vet students don't really go home during the Christmas break. They stay on, hold down a job in the expectation of commencing their studies in the following year. So a lot of the vet student population in 2020 were already in Australia well ahead of any travel restrictions being discussed. So yeah, it became the least impacted sector. And because, as I said earlier, many of the students were kind of stuck here because they couldn't leave the country with international travel being so restricted, I think many of those students chose to do further study that they might not have otherwise done. So we're still seeing overall a lot of growth in vet enrolments, even though commencements are starting to drop a bit. And lastly, higher education was also fairly resilient. Again, largely that effect of most of the students were here at the start of the year. It was probably the Chinese students who were most affected in the higher education sector, because many of them had gone home for Chinese New Year in the expectation of returning in a couple of weeks later, but that's about when COVID-19 hit. So with the Chinese student population, that's where we're seeing about 50% of Chinese students are stuck outside Australia, but still studying. Okay, next slide. So I'm sort of wrapping up now, but this is my bold prediction of how 2021 might unfold. What we can see in our currently published 2020 data, so our latest data release is the December data for 2020. So essentially that's capturing the whole year-to-date year of 2020. So in the data, it's possible to establish when students are planning, or you know, when is the course they're enrolled in going to finish. So what you can see here is that in December, the large proportion of enrolled students were in courses that were going to continue into 2021. So we think it's a reasonable guess that that many students will proceed with their plans, as they have showed that resilience to stick to their studies in 2020. We expect that will continue this year. So again, I made this bold prediction of anticipating that sum there at the bottom of the slide of 413,772 continuing students, we will still see on our books on the 1st of January 2021. There I'm talking about when the data is available, so January data will be available in the next few weeks. So I expect we will see that there. Next slide, please. So again, sorry, my bold prediction based on what is mostly real data. So what I'm showing you, firstly in that top row is a prediction of 2021. So I've taken that figure from the last slide of 413,772 as the number of students we expect to be continuing their studies from 2020 into 2021. Then I've added there a known figure of how many commencements we might see in a 6-month period where COVID-19 is having its full impact. So that's actually the number from slide 5, a couple of slides back, where I was showing you the number of commencements between July and December 2020, when COVID-19 was certainly impacting fully. So if you add those two numbers together, you would get a sort of guesstimate of how many enrolments we might have by the 30th of June, 571,122. So that's a guess, but what I've done in that second row is to apply that same formula to known data in 2020. So we pulled out the expected number of students on the 1st of January 2020, or in fact the known number of students on that day, the number of commencements in the second half of 2020, add them together, and that number turns out to be pretty much what we saw at the end of June in 2020. So what I'm saying is, in that first row, applying that same logic to what we know about 2021 so far, we should get a figure in the order of 570,000 students. So that's a substantial decline in enrolments of 21%. That's the bottom row. Talking commencements, that would be a decline of 35%. And that's based on the fact, firstly, that we just didn't have as many returning students as we might normally had. So that first column, the returning students figure, is down 14% in 2021 compared to 2020. So there you go. So that's my bold prediction for 2021. We'll be seeing something in the order of a 20% decline in student enrolments by the middle of the year. But again, it's not zero. I think this is more something to celebrate than feel depressed about. As I say, again, in the early parts of 2020, people were predicting, all sorts of doom and gloom that just hasn't eventuated. So it's a serious situation, and I appreciate many of our providers are being seriously impacted by this drop in student numbers and hence in their revenue. I just want to sort of paint a positive picture that things aren't nearly as bad as people were predicting. There are still opportunities to sign up students who've never studied in Australia before. We are seeing that's happening in the data. There's every expectation that will continue in 2021. So I guess my take-home message is don't completely lose heart. And another bit of potential good news is my last slide, the next slide. Something else we were reporting throughout 2020 was the number of international student deferments. So I said earlier at the start of the presentation, what we saw in 2020 is most students chose to continue their studies despite the travel restrictions imposed. So many of them continued their studies from outside Australia. Nonetheless, let's say something in the order of 10% chose to defer their studies. So that's that big, huge peak in the orange line there for 2020 compared to 2019 deferments. What we've seen as that situation has evolved over time is that a lot of those students, although they initially deferred, they've since kind of shrugged their shoulders and decided to get on with it. So they've returned to their studies. So 36% of those initial deferments have returned to their studies, and many of them are now finished. And another third have locked in a new start date, mostly in 2021. And another third have, I think they're just hedging their bets on when the planes fly again rather than necessarily cancelling. So in a nutshell, that ends up being about 50,000 students there who are sort of waiting in the wings for the possibility that the planes fly again. So once that happens, we may see this huge influx of new students we perhaps weren't anticipating just from the deferment pool here. So thank you. I hope that's been useful. I hope I've given the marketers out there some reason to hope there is value in continuing to market. It'll be a smaller market than we've seen in previous years, but there's all sorts of new models out there that we can engage students in. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Steve Nerlich. We really appreciate that. So we are welcoming questions for Steve. Please submit them through the Q&A if you have any. Kerry Ramirez is saying that this was excellent and thank you for sharing your views. I actually do have a question. We have some questions, but before we approach that, I do have one, which is about all these students that are actually continuing online. Do you have data as to what most countries are they coming from? Where are they located? You seem to be muted, Steve. Sorry, you're muted, Steve.
Sorry, it's easy to hear me when I'm not muted. So I don't have that data to hand, but certainly it's clear the country with the largest proportion of students stuck outside Australia is China. So that proportion approaches 50%. For the other countries, it's more in the order of 20% by and large. So yeah, every country is a slightly different story, but that's the big picture.
Got it. We have a question from Rishi Ranjan. He is the Regional Recruitment Manager at the Australian Institute of Higher Education. I'm not so sure if you are going to be able to answer this because it relates to the Department of Home Affairs, but nonetheless, I'll read it and then you may or may not answer this. But he's talking about the visa refusals coming from India, and in his experience, he is seeing a lot of rejections and no business not being granted on what he believes are not reasonable reasons. So
well, perhaps I should jump in, George. Yeah, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to answer that. That's really a question for Department of Home Affairs. I don't think they'd appreciate me offering an opinion.
I figure. And so yes, sorry, Rishi. Steve works for the Department of Education, so different departments, and it will not be fair as he ventures to comment on this. We had Kidel Shambu. Is there any indication from government as to when will they open? And again, a question that we are obviously reading out loud here, not necessarily for you to be able to answer, but do you want to share any thoughts?
Yeah, well, there's certainly no easy answer to that. The stated position from the PM and our minister as well is essentially, you know, we're obliged to make our priority returning Australians. That doesn't mean we can't also accommodate international students as well. But that, you know, we have to consider flight capacities and quarantine capacity with that in mind. But essentially, we put that question back to the states and territories. So the ball is somewhat in their court to come up with a model that's acceptable to them, and then put that to the Commonwealth as a proposition. So I have to say, to some extent, the ball is in the state and territories court there. But yeah, I hope I've mapped out all of the various factors in play at the moment. And essentially the answer is I don't know.
I've got a question as well, George, actually, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Steve, do you see any, in that enrollment data, do you see any concentration between certain universities or groups of universities? So obviously that's looking at the whole sector. Are we seeing that, you know, the share is actually going to certain groups rather than being spread as equally across the sector?
Look, we don't publish provider data, so universities and other education providers data through prisms. There's higher education data available in the public domain about universities and other higher education providers from what's called the HEAMS system. I mean, I'm comfortable saying what we're seeing at the moment is in 2020, I mean, that's the latest data I have access to, is quite similar proportionally to what we've seen in previous years. And what we've seen in previous years is, you know, the group of 8 tend to be the most popular universities for international students out of all universities. That hasn't really changed. It somewhat depends which country students are from. So the group of 8 is very popular with Chinese students, perhaps less so with some of the South Asian students, including India. They're more likely to go to different Victorian universities, particularly, some of whom have a VET connection. That's a popular pathway for Indian students. But certainly if you took the whole population of international students, because China is such a dominant part of that, you tend to get the picture that international students favour the group of 8 over other universities. I hope that answers your question.
Great question, Marcus. I actually had the same doubt, and I guess Steve is confirming the GOA. And to that point, actually, we had Nishan, who is a senior regional manager at the University of Sydney, raised a question. So, of course, relates to what you were saying. And so, in terms of these remote commencements, is there any insights on region-specific areas like South Asia versus China versus the Middle East? And again, that relates to the question I was asking about the countries. But do you have any other insights you can share about that particularly?
Yes, again, sorry, I don't have numbers at my fingertips, but it's certainly the case that China, as usual, dominates the data. So in deferments, China represents both the biggest volume of students and also the largest proportion. They have the largest proportion of their students choosing to defer, I guess because they were most impacted by the travel restrictions with, and hence, you know, have the largest proportion of students who are stuck offshore. Nonetheless, the same principle I discussed before applies, where although we've seen many students defer, most haven't, and that's also the case for China. I think I'm answering the question. There was another bit to it. I mean, I saw in the text there something about, students more likely to defer if they're online. So that doesn't entirely make sense insofar as anyone who's stuck outside Australia is essentially studying online. They don't really have another option available to them. So we might as well just say anyone who is in that outside Australia cohort is studying online. So it's certainly the case that the majority, though not all, deferred students were in that population of students outside Australia.
We have a question from Minu Isar. She is the manager of international admissions at Central Queensland University. I guess it's fair given that your projections were looking at mid-2021. But given other countries, UK, US, Canada, had now opened their borders to international students, will there be any shifts in your projections for mid-2021 commencements for Australia, as the borders were closed for all countries in 2020, but that is obviously not the case anymore?
Look, great question. It's really pure guesswork there. We've been looking at our competitor countries' data. I'll just say as a factual point, I mean, our data is just better than theirs. I mean, I don't think that's a matter of opinion. We have much more current data, much more comprehensive data than most of our competitors. So comparisons are difficult on those grounds, apart from anything else. Recently, we've seen their 2020 visa data come out, so we can compare the US, the UK, Canada student visa data with our student visa data. What we've seen there is everyone's been hugely impacted. So just having your borders open doesn't mean you had an unrestricted flow of international students into your country necessarily. As I say, part of the impact of COVID-19 is quite hard to leave your country as much as it is to enter another country. So, unfortunately, I don't have numbers available at my fingertips, but I think the only country who's perhaps seeing a strong recovery out the other side of COVID-19 at the moment is the UK in terms of international student numbers. Canada's visa data still looks pretty grim, or at least it's no better or worse than ours. And the US has certainly seen a huge drop in visas granted to new students. So look, I'm not convinced there's enough in that story to suggest we are going to lose students to other countries. The impact in lost students we've seen to date, I think, is more just about students aren't traveling anywhere much. So yeah, that's probably the best answer I can give you, is that sort of vague picture of, I'm not sure we're losing students to other countries, everyone's being impacted. But yeah, we need to keep an eye on the UK. They seem to be recovering
for sure
quicker than others.
Thank you, Dr. Steve. There's a few more questions. Obviously, time's of the essence, and we cannot address them verbally, all of them right now. But Steve will be able to answer them in writing for you guys. As we now need to move on to Marcus for the second part of today's session. I think I even saw some questions that actually relate to Marcus's part of the presentation. So over to you, Marcus.
Thanks, George. Ross, you can start on the next slide, actually. Thank you. So today I'm just going to talk about inside sales and conversion and how we're approaching it a little bit at MacQuarie. Some of you, I'm sure, have been exposed to inside sales at some point in your career, perhaps at your current institution. But for those that haven't, essentially what it means is it's just remote sales. And this table here shows some of the differences, how we can think about it in terms of the differences between an inside team and our regional team. So regional teams obviously being in the field, inside are remote via different digital channels. Our regional teams involved in strategic relation-based type interactions. This is where the agenda is set, the strategy is set for a lot of our recruitment, whereas the inside team are much more campaign-based and transactional. Our regional team would give market insight. They are the experts in the markets. But our inside team can provide student insight. They're talking to students regularly, and they're getting more information about the types of decisions or blockages that are happening for students. And both of these teams need expert product knowledge. They both need really high emotional intelligence, but the emotional intelligence side is perhaps slightly different, whereas in the field and in our regional teams, in our country teams, it's more about situational awareness and something around those complex relationships. Whereas in the inside teams, we're talking about that empathy of the decision process. And this is where, because of this, at MacQuarie, we will tend to use international students for these roles. So we do that for a number of reasons. We do that because we want to give our students opportunities. We back our students as being great. But also there's benefits for us in this type of work, language and knowledge of our product, and obviously going through that process. So that's one of the ways we think about it. Ross, just the next click. So thank you. So at MacQuarie, this is a simple view of how our structure looks like in the international side. We have the international recruitment teams, which is where the strategy happens. So if we think about that space, this is the strategy and our high-level complex strategic activities. We have our international marketing team, and this is my team, where it's split up between Marcoms and the contact team, which is our inside team. And this is really campaigns. So we've got strategy, we've got campaigns, and then we have our international operations who do a whole bunch of things, but in the context of conversion and sales, it's really around admissions. And it's not just the processing of applications, it's the pre-sales work that is happening throughout that process. And all of these teams are complementing each other and working with each other throughout this process. Next slide, please, Ross. So when we think about how we structure this activity, initially we were going down the path, as many of you may have, trying to create really complex, personalized journeys for whatever student may exist. But the thing that we found much more useful is actually to bring it up, to simplify that process down into some key stages, to simplify it into some really trackable goals, and just a couple of them. And it's really about moving the student, or the largest number of students, through the process, through each step. So in each of these goals that we would be looking at, we're looking for quantitative and qualitative measures on where a student's at. And the stages here that you're seeing are probably all pretty familiar to you, but it's just mapping some of these goals that would identify for us when those students are passing through those stages. Next slide, Ross, please. So while at the stage level and the goal level, we're all sharing the goals. So we've got our market, our campaigns, the strategy, the field, the regional teams, the admissions teams. We're all really sharing the goals and the results of each of these. But at the activity level, it's really important that we map this to particular teams. And this is for a number of reasons. The most important reason, or the obvious reason, is for clarity of who's doing what. But the real important reason is so that we can map data flow and system flow. So at each of these different types of activities, and these are just some examples, a bit of a example of some of the activities that might exist. There's going to be data that is required to do that activity, and there's data that we will capture throughout that activity that will help us move to the next stage. So you can see, once we can start to understand that, who's doing what system it's moving through, when it needs to hand over to the next group, this becomes really important in the mapping of these things. And these symbols here are just a demonstration of how multiple teams could be used across different stages. So each of those symbols are representing different teams. Next slide, please, Ross. And then when it comes to tracking through this activity and how we approach it, there's really two critical things that we're trying to track. One is how many at each stage, and the other one is quality and health. And the way that we do that, and you'll notice in these goals, there'll be qualify interest a lot throughout that. That is one of the qualitative measures that we'll be using. This is an assessment our teams will be trying to make. And we do that in a very simple scale, not interested. So clearly, you know, we don't need to do anything further there. Researching, considering or comparing, and ready. So at each point, we're trying to measure this as well as how many people go through there. And the reason that this is important is because it really allows us to know where to focus our attention, where there may be blockages, but also gives us really good insight into what's working. So for example, if we were looking at app starts, and within the app start stage, the majority of the app starts were researching rather than considering already, we would know that there's something that we should be investigating further down the pipeline to understand why is it that those people at those stage are researching. Is it because we have not provided enough information earlier? Is it something on the website which drives people looking to inquire to an application start instead? So we can use this to identify blockages, but on the flip side, we can also use it to identify success. So if in that same bucket, the app starts, we're not researching or not interested, but rather they were majority ready, what we would be able to do is you know, link that back to the activities that we have been running, and to start to identify what types of activities are actually driving results or helping us to progress. And you know, maybe identify things that we want to scale up. Next slide, please. So we have at that activity, at the goal level, we have these main goals. This is about moving people through stages. At activity levels, we would also have some sort of micro conversion or objective. And often what that really is about is capturing some additional information about that would help us to move people towards the goal in that stage. So in this example, we're looking at a pre-application student, a digital event that we may be doing for people at that pre-application stage. And the data that we needed to perform that activity is a first name, last name, country, and an email. But our objective and our goal of that activity is actually to capture their course preference and their intake preference. And that alone isn't going to be enough for us to move it to the next stage. But what we can then start to do with that information is start to create new activities that may help us to do that. So for example, the logical thing here would be to do is, if we've run this event, we have now captured this information. We can see within that information that we have groups of students that are indicating they want to start at different intakes. We can then start to split them into cohorts, which we deal with at different times. Or if we see concentrations in certain courses, we can start to go down a level. Perhaps, you know, say for example, they were business students. We may take that and look at what marketing activities or what activities can we do around business students to help them start an application because they're pre-application. So we can use this information with these micro conversions to help us move forward on those goals and those stages as well. Next slide, please. So I guess with COVID, like the main thing that has come out of it is it's just reminded us how flexible we have to be and to be testing things all the time. But some of the biggest takeaways, I guess, for me and for our team has been around these three things. The first one being that students will tell you a lot about themselves and your product if you ask the right questions. So it's about finding those right questions and the time to ask those questions. And, you know, an example of this, an example of this could be, for example, a contact form on a website. That's an interaction. That is a piece of attention that you have captured. But the typical approach to doing that would be to have the least amount of information in there to convert the form. But we're not converting forms, we're trying to convert students. So if we have attention and if students are willing to provide more information that can help us to progress them faster through some of these stages, it could be interesting to look at, you know, how do you capture that attention at that point in time, rather than having to go back and do additional activities to then capture that detail. So that's something that we're thinking about. The other piece is really around how we deliver technical solutions to support these processes that we're putting in place. And so the focus for us has shifted from the application layer to the data layer. And the main reason for that is because enterprise technical solutions are so slow. They're often multi-tenanted with other parts of the university, full of compromise to get your business process in there. And so by focusing on the data layer, and we use an enterprise governed data layer at the university, but adding low code solutions to the top has allowed us to move much faster. And this has been particularly important during COVID, as we had to shift more from the regions and the field to our inside teams to pick up some of the contact and campaigning with students. These low code solutions were allowed us to really act quickly and scale up. And so thinking about how we structure data, what is our integration layer, what is our application layer, but thinking more of the application layer as a consumable layer, and the data layer is really our strategic layer. And then finally, it's really about the basics. So the previous slides that I've shown here are about clarity of stage and goals, all really basic things. You know, there's heaps of stuff out on, you know, conversational AI and automation and chatbots and a whole bunch of new channels that we could be looking at. But they don't replace strategy. They don't replace good process. They don't replace good data. They can amplify it. So, but by focusing on getting some of these flows right, by tracking what's working, provides more opportunity for us to, and by understanding our data flows, yeah, it gives us more opportunities to put these things in. So, yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Marcus. Everyone, feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A for Marcus to verbally answer. I do actually have some already. So you mentioned that you use current students. At what point, because of all the training that you are providing, do these current international students end up becoming now a staff member, right? Given the fact that they are on campus and they're obviously answering questions and they're being guided by you yourselves.
So that was kind of unintentional, but a number of them have. For us, that inside team is a really good training ground for people that we potentially want to move into our recruitment teams, whether that be admissions, because they all have different skills and different qualities. You know, we've had people move into our marketing team, we've had people move into admissions, we've had people move into the recruitment teams. And then there's others that, you know, they're doing this as their job. They love MacQuarie, but they're doing it as their job and they want to go and do something with the degree that they've just earned as well. So it's not something that we deliberately try to push people through, but people do kind of self-identify as being interested in international education, and there's heaps of pathways for them once that happens.
Thank you. You also talk about measuring the health of the pipeline, and then what sort of percentage should be, I guess, ideal to have as they're ready to go ahead and apply, that you will say? So what percentage of that pipeline you think it should be there, ideally?
We're working through this stuff as well. So, you know, all the time we're kind of adapting the way that we do this. I don't know if there is a threshold that we're looking for. Part of it's common sense as well. So the example I gave of the app starts was actually a real case that we had with one of our online degrees, where we had a high number of applications come through, but we were able to identify that those people were actually in a different mindset to apply through some of these processes. So it's, I don't know if there's particular thresholds. It still needs, you know, recruiters and marketers and people that understand this pipeline looking at it and interpreting the information, but it helps to identify where there could be problems and gives us some sort of sense of where there are problems.
Thank you. On your last slide, you talk about conversational AI and chatbots and a few other things like that. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more about all of that, please?
Well, there's a whole bunch of technologies that are emerging now in order to help you scale some of your contact. So chatbots and conversational AI probably go hand in hand. You know, this is, you know, at the most basic form, they're smart live chat, you know, or they're smart chat and I don't know, triage kind of systems, I guess you could use them as. I guess with us, we are looking at some of these things and we're keeping an eye on them. But we're really focusing on the process and the data. And so that is, you know, how do we get more scale out of a team? And that's the other challenge with COVID, is that we have to do the same amount or more now with the same or less resource. And so this is where process has become really important. And then there are things that will help us with process along the way. It could be automations, there could be other bits and pieces, but for me, at least, that's where the biggest gains exist still.
Thank
and
you.
It's only once you reach a use case that, you know, when you have a problem, then these things might solve it. Like if we had a large amount of chats coming through our site, or we had, then conversational AI could help us to service that. But it might be a more useful thing to do in a student service context than in a recruitment context, where the volumes would justify it.
Question from Ranjan, Rishi Ranjan. Hi, Marcus. Do you feel there has been a major shift in the thought process of potential applicants while inquiring, considering in COVID times they will be having more questions?
Like they've got lots of things to consider. Like I guess, you know, the obvious one is that now they need to decide whether they want to commence their degree online. A big part of international education is the experience that you have in Australia, not just in the educational setting, but in like culturally and socially, by getting part-time work and meeting friends and developing language. So I guess, you know, and that's where we see, you know, people really hanging on when the borders are opening and making their decisions. I think early on, people were quite happy to take what the universities were saying, that they could do their year online and then come back. But if you're a master's student doing 2 years, then you could be coming up for your second year now, fully online. And that's, it does have an impact on the way people think about the value of international education in Australia. So from that point, and perhaps that's where we see the deferrals and things happening as well.
No, that's great. I wish we had more time because there are some really good questions there, like the one by Margot as an example. But thank you everyone for your questions. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. We hope that you got a lot of today's session and that it has set the scene for obviously the remainder of this year. Before you head off, don't forget to give your feedback on today's session via the quick poll that is now on your screen. While you answer the poll, I actually have a couple of upcoming event announcements. Firstly, I'm excited to announce the Marketing and Recruitment Network Forum 2021. It's slated to be held in person, face-to-face in Canberra from Thursday 10th to Friday the 11th of June, so mid this year. While we're working closely with the IEAA Secretariat to ensure this event can go ahead face-to-face, we do have a virtual contingency plan in case interstate travel or gathering becomes largely unfeasible. So we'll keep you guys updated and provide you with more information shortly, but we do, however, recommend you avoid booking flights or accommodation until closer to the event. Fingers crossed, we can actually do it with face-to-face. Lastly, I am pleased to share that the AIC will be held in Gold Coast in October this year. And of course, we look forward to gathering together for this important occasion, all of us here in this industry, and keep an eye out for further updates, including a call for proposals and registration that should be coming soon out of them. Thank you so much, Dr. Steve Nerlich and Marcus Binchman, for your time. I really appreciate, of course, you putting this together. And you guys have a good day. And so everyone of our attendees, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Marcus. And yes, the recordings and everything will be sent out next week to everyone. Have a great afternoon.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.